right. Volume services. We referred to these a little bit when we were talking about volumes, and now we're going to find out what they are. A Panasys director uses a volume service to provide PanFS OS metadata to DirectFlow clients. A volume service is a pair of services that runs on a Panasys director. We already met the storage manager. We were talking about RAID. And we talked about the file manager a little bit when we were talking about callbacks. So the file manager handles directory entries, issues object callbacks to DirectFlow clients. The storage manager handles object metadata components and issues capabilities to DirectFlow client. The FM and the SM together are known as a sibling group. The volume service is shown in the GUI and PlanCloud with the file manager ID for the sibling group pair. So it has this form 0x04 and some stuff. Corresponding SMID is 0x02 and the very same stuff. The FM and the SM run under the Pan Manager service on a director. Pan Manager is the actual manager service. These are technically virtual submanagers. The Realm president assigns a volume to a volume service when the volume is created. Multiple volumes may be assigned to the same volume service. Once the volume is created, its volume service cannot be changed. We talked about this in volumes. Why? Because every object in the group has both the volume service, storage manager ID, and the group's ID is part of its object ID. For example, in this object ID, device 02 is the storage manager. Group, this designates the volume that the object is in, and U, this is the unifier for the object. So every object has the storage manager ID. We can't change it because we have no way of changing all these objects. The director that runs the volume service that the volume is assigned to is called its volume owner. Volume owner director keeps transaction logs for its metadata operations so that pending operations may be replayed. This again is how we keep the file system coherent and without corruption. If the transaction logs are lost, offline file system recovery, known as FSRC, must run on each volume in the volume service to make sure that the PanFS metadata is consistent for every object in the volume. Director's kernel keeps transaction log service to insert and delete important metadata in its transaction logs. The FM or SM records a pending metadata operation in its transaction log. Once the operation is complete, the FM or SM deletes the operation record. These records include changes to directory, changes to data components, and object repairs. The FM also tracks DirectFlow clients that have outstanding callbacks. The SM tracks objects that DirectFlow clients are writing to. The FM and the SM work through the parent Pan Manager service and the transaction log service to store and retrieve these, and they keep a separate set of transaction logs for every active or failover volume service on the director. We're going to talk about what those are in just a second. Okay. Just as the root volume is special, the volume service for the root volume cannot contain any other volume. Root volume, critically important, so it has a volume service all by itself. The metadata load for the root volume is not large, so the size of its transaction logs and caches are much smaller than the corresponding sizes for the other volume services. We take this into account when we're balancing the volume services. Volume services that can contain non-root volumes are called full volume services. NFS-OS provides redundancy for the critical metadata operations. This is a very key point in our architecture. The realm must contain 2 or more directors of the same hardware type. Hardware type means either Bravo or Delta. They are the same as this or alpha director blades. Volume service failover must be enabled. This is the default configuration. Each volume service is assigned to one primary volume owner director. The primary volume owner director usually is the active volume owner director. The primary volume owner is the director that the system prefers to be the active volume owner. And the active volume owner is the directory currently running the volume service in active mode. This is kind of different ways of saying similar ideas. The president starts the volume service on the active volume owner director. These run under the PAN manager service. The active volume owner handles all metadata requests for the volumes in the volume service. Here we are. Here's our configuration. We're going to go to storage, service configuration, enable volume service failover. And again, that is the default. If volume service failover is enabled, the president assigns a backup director for each volume service. The backup director usually serves as the failover director. The backup director is the director that the system prefers to be the failover director. The failover director is the director that is currently running the volume service in backup mode. We'll talk about the failover a little bit later. The backup director must be the same director hardware type as the primary volume owner director. That means that if it's a ASD, if it's an ASD, the backup must be an ASD. Doesn't matter whether it's a 200 or 100. Failover director makes no metadata actions for this volume service at all. It is simply waiting to be perhaps the active volume owner director. The relationship between the active volume owner and the failover director is active-passive. And this relationship is per volume service. It's not between the directors. The storage volumes service ownership page shows the volume services and their current director assignments. All columns except for the volumes are sortable. The default sort is by service ID on the GUI. Put the active director node column to sort by that column. So then we have a box summarizing the number of volume services in each health category. Here we are. Here's our example. You can see here the little up arrows. We have sorted this now primary director node. Here's our service IDs. We have both the name and the IP. Here's the backups. And here is the right side of that listing with the backups. Here is a link to the historical event log, the volume count, And here are the actual volumes in the volume service. Volume service includes a search box. So if we want to look at all volume services that have ASD 1.2 participating them in there, we put that in there. We can see that ASD 1.2 is, here's the left side of that box. It is the primary volume owner for this volume service that ends in 1C. It is the backup director for the one that ends in 1B. Put it there. And again, like all the search boxes saying, I'm showing you 2 records of 4. The storage administrator may move a volume service from one director to another. The parent and manager service does not move. Those are tied permanently to the director, but there may be several volume services run on that. President copies the transaction logs for the volume server being moved from the existing primary volume owner to the new primary volume owner director. If the storage administrator moves the backup director assignment, the president copies the volume service transaction logs from the primary director owner to the new backup director. You do not want to manually move a volume service if the service is offline, degraded, or does not have a current failover director without talking to us first. These transaction log moves are very important. If the president cannot find a good set of transaction logs when you've executed a move, they're lost, they're deleted. The volumes must undergo mandatory FSRC. That could take anywhere from 3 minutes to 3 days. So we don't want to do that unless it's absolutely necessary. Depending on the number of objects in the volume and the circumstances that caused the volume to go into FSRC. So to move a volume service, we go to storage, volume, service ownership, and we scroll down to the move a service manually. We're going to choose the service to move. And we give some information that the key thing is the service ID, but it tells you a little about it currently so that you can figure this out. We're going to move volume service 1C off of ASD 1.2 because we intend to replace that node. Now, we're going to choose the director that will become the primary volume owner. We're going to choose 1.3 because we will see later that 1.1 was the current backup and this is more efficient. So we're going to choose to move the volume service to 1.3. Then we click Move Service. This takes a second. The GUI is also slower to update the volume services than PanCLI is, but we're going to see that it says successfully moved the volume service this to director node, and it gives the data serial number for some reason that's not particularly helpful. Again, it takes a second because the president has to stop and start the volume services, move the logs, and bring them back up. Service ownership refreshes when the move is complete. The volume service may be briefly shown as offline with a yellow triangle because the president does actually have to take the volume service down to move it, but this is only momentary. President must, the volume service is now shown as online with an active director of ASD 1.3. The backup director may also be changed from the same page. We're going to choose the volume service, and this time I'm going to choose the backup. We're going to move the backup off of ASD 1.2 because we intend to replace that node. We'll see later that when we talk about replacing nodes, that I don't necessarily recommend that you move the backup. We're illustrating the point here. Now we're going to choose the director that will become the backup, and we don't want to. We can't choose the one that's already the primary. So we're going to choose 1.1. Move that. We also have to take in consideration the number of volume services. The total number of primary and backup services that any director can host is 5. That has to do with space available on the NVDIMM. We're going to move the backup service to a different director this time, not move service, but move backup. Again, after just a second, successfully move backup service to director node, and it tells us the data serial number instead of the IP address. Service ownership page refreshes a short time after the move is complete. Again, the volume service does have to go down for just a second, and you may catch it, but usually it's not visible. Now the volume service is shown online with a failover a backup director node of ASD 1.1. Remember, when we created volumes, we just used the automatic selection by system. But on a round-robin basis, you may decide to select the volume service when creating a volume. Let's say you have 2 volumes in your system, both of which have very high metadata loads. You do not want them to be on the same volume service. You would like them to be on separate volume services to maximize your metadata output. So when you create the second high maintenance volume, you can choose the volume service, drop down on the volume create form. The row shows the current volume owner and the number of volumes in the volume service and the volume service ID. I mean, you're not choosing the director that's going to manage this, because you can move the service at any time. It just shows the director for easy reference. You're choosing the volume service, and you can only choose this assignment at the time the volume is created. As we said before, it can't be changed afterwards. So here we are. We're creating data in set 1, and you can see instead of automatic selection by system, which would be the round robin, we want to put this on volume service 17. And how do we know we want it on 17? We would have to look at the volume service assignments beforehand to decide which one we want. It's currently on ASD 1.2, but that could change at any time. The key thing is this 17 right here. So we create the volume. Now we want to go to the volume service ownership and verify that this was created on the service ID that we wanted. Yes, it is. Yes, it was. Volume service failover, and this is the whole purpose of all of this. The president controls whether the volume service is enabled for failover. The president starts the volume service in active mode. President orders the primary volume owner to send a complete copy of the volume service transaction logs to the backup director. Once the backup director has received the transaction logs, the president's going to start the volume service in backup mode on the backup director. The volume service is now running in backup enabled mode. The primary volume owner is serving as the active volume owner. The backup director is serving as the failover director. Okay. So the clients are accessing the volume. They're doing a lot of transactions. The primary volume owner director is going to be sending the backup director transaction log updates. The backup transaction logs are kept current. If the primary volume owner tells the president, hey, I couldn't send the backup director these transaction logs, the president disables the backup and deletes its backup transaction log. This is critical. The only thing worse than no backup is a stale backup. We would rather have no backup than a backup with the incorrect information. This happens, the volume service is running in backup disabled mode. President's then trying to re-enable the backup director. If this is successful, the primary volume owner director sends the backup director a fresh set of transaction logs. When the PAN manager services fails to send heartbeat to the president, either because the service is unhealthy or the director itself is not responding, the president takes the following actions. It puts any volume service the unhealthy director manages as primary volume owner into an offline state. The volumes in the volume services are down and inaccessible. The president starts a 90-second wait period to take further action. The president also disables the backup for any volume services that the unhealthy director serves as backup for. After 90 seconds, if we're still not responding, the president fails the backup service over to the backup director. We want to wait because we don't want to have needless failovers due to network hookups. The backup director is still the backup director, but is now serving as the active volume owner. It is the one that is issuing metadata transactions. It can pick up right up where the primary volume left off because it has a current copy of the metadata transaction logs for the volume service. As soon as this failover is complete, the president brings the volumes and the volume service online. The volume service now has no failover director mode node. The service is on the backup. The primary is out to lunch, so there's an active and no failover. If the primary volume owner director's PAN manager reestablishes heartbeat after this 90 seconds, the president fails the volume service back to the primary volume owner director. This is because we want these things to be balanced. If we just leave them all over the place, they're going to be unbalanced and the metadata load would be too high. Primary volume owner director's transaction logs are now stale because the backup was issuing it. So the president deletes the primary volume owner's logs and it copies the transaction logs from the backup director back to the primary volume owner director. President then re-enables the backup director. And now the primary volume owner director can pick up where the backup director left off because it now has a current copy of the metadata transaction logs for the volume service. After this failback, the primary volume owner is again serving as the active volume owner, and the backup director is again serving as the failover director. Both the GUI and PanCli just call these backup and primaries because referring to backup and failover is just too complicated to display in one nice picture. Okay, down we're looking at the backup. We're going back to the situation where we've disabled the backup for an unhealthy director. The volumes in the volume service are still accessible because the primary is still functioning. If the backup director's service reestablishes Heartbeat, the president's going to reestablish it as the backup director. If the backup volume director does not reestablish Heartbeat, the president leaves the volume service without a backup until the storage administrator takes action. If the backup director was bad and you replace it, the president's going to assign a new backup director. If the storage administrator manually moves the backup service to a different director, again, the president's going to enable that director as a backup director. In either case, the president's going to copy the transaction logs from the primary volume owner to the new backup director. Please contact us before doing either of these. We do not want to just replace directors because they may not be bad. Sometimes it's not a good idea to be moving the backup service because that can be complicated. So if we're going to be doing this, we're going to talk to us. Here we have a series of slides showing the Pan Manager service on ASD 1.2 stopping sending Heartbeat to the president one time. As a matter of fact, I reproduced this by simply turning off Pan Manager. Failover process is the same if the director itself is not responding. Either way, Pan Manager on ASD 1.2 is not sending Heartbeat. Here we are before this situation. Here's ASD 1.2 is the primary on 1C. It is the backup on 1B. Okay. Here is the vol service list showing the same data at this point. 1.2 is the primary, is the backup on 1C. 1.2 is the backup on 1B. All volumes online. Now, I manually stop Pan Manager on ASD 1.2. A few seconds later, ASD 1.3, which is the primary owner for 1B, tells the president, I can't transmit backup logs to the backup director. This doesn't even, the heartbeat happens once every 30 seconds, but assuming that there's activity on this, 1.3 is going to know very, very quickly that it cannot transmit backup transaction log updates. So the president knows that the backup on 1.2 is stale, so it disables the backup. Then on 1B. On 1C, where OSD 1.2 was the primary, we're going to put this into offline state 40 seconds after ASD 1.2 becomes unhealthy. In this case, it is because Pan Manager missed Heartbeat with failed Heartbeat on the president. So here we are, we're looking at this on vol service list. The GUI does not do a great job of showing error conditions on the volume services. So when we're going to troubleshoot those, we're going to go to PanCli. So here we are. These two volume services are unaffected. This is 1C is the volume service where ASD 1.2 is the primary. The volume service is offline. On 1B, it was the backup. This is online, but the backup is disabled, so we're going to show it as no backup. The volume, the alerts on the volume page are very accurate. They're going to immediately show that the two volumes are not accessible. These are the two volumes where the volume service is offline. You see that? And it also tells you a different warning that this 1B does not have a backup. This is 1B. This is the one where ASD 1.2 was the backup. This is a little bit inaccurate here, but the system status area in the realm shows a critical error state, and the GUI is not showing this properly. But the key thing is you see alerts here, you go to PanCli to ask PanCli about the volume services. Here we are looking at the volumes. The volumes on the offline volume services are not accessible. See these bright, nice error signs. Okay. 90 seconds. We're waiting to give Pan Manager on 1.2 a chance to reestablish heartbeat. If it's not heart beating because the director has panicked and rebooted, it's going to be coming up. All right. As a matter of fact, it was 80 seconds. I timed it. So now the president says, all right, your grace period's up. I'm going to restart 1C on the backup director 1.1. Let's go back and look and see what it was. You see here, 1.1 was the backup. After the failover, it is functioning as the active director. Okay. And the volumes are coming online, but the service ID now has no failover director because the service is running on the backup. These volumes now come back online. Here we are, the volumes are back online. 80 seconds outage. And again, the GUI is listing these in an appropriate condition. I will check to make sure, see whether these are fixed, but PanCli shows them in a proper condition. Okay. Here are the warnings. The critical errors that projects and software are automatically cleared. We're going to show information items that these two have come online. And we're going to show a warning that the volume service 1C has failed over, leaving no backup. We're showing a warning on 1C that it does not have a backup because it doesn't say this, but the reason is because the volume service is running on the backup, not the primary. And then we have a different warning. It says the same thing, that the service backup is disabled because it's not have a backup. And this is proper. These are warnings. We no longer have redundancy for the transaction logs on these volume services. Yeah. All right. Let's say 1.2 becomes healthy again and reestablishes heartbeat. President first enables the backups. Why does it deal with the backups first? Because we want to, the president's imperative is to make sure there are no stale backups. So it deals with the backups first. It's going to re-enable 1.2 as a backup on 1B. It's going to copy the I'm missing a step here. in the process of enabling 1.2 as the backup, it's going to copy the whole transaction logs from the primary to ASD 1.2. Now this is enabled as a backup. Okay, now remember ASD 1.2 was the primary for 1C. ASD 1.1 is the backup, but it's currently serving as active. So the president's going to copy those transaction logs from 1C from the serving active director, 1.1 to 1.2. Now it's going to fail the volume service 1C back to 1.2. 1.2 is now the active volume owner, president, and the primary. President's going to re-enable 1.1 as the failover director. All volumes are online this, and both volume services have primary active and backup failover directors, and the system clears the volume service warnings. So here we are, and we're back to all good. You see on the alerts, all these have cleared. I know this is confusing. I spent a lot of time writing and rewriting this, but I want you to kind of understand a little bit of this so it's not bewildering when you see it. I mean, your action when you see this, if it happens and it was a little blip, we need to know. We need to know why things failed over. And to make sure if it was a network blip, then we look at the networking. If it was not a network blip, we need to find what was going on. So here we are back up. Changing the topic just a little bit. In rare cases, neither the primary nor the backup volume owner director have a usable set of metadata transaction logs. The most common cause of this is that somebody moved the volume service when it was in this stage. The president had just disabled a stale backup, and then somebody moved the volume service, and the logs are lost. It's called losing the transaction logs. If the critical metadata transaction logs are not saved on either the primary or the backup volume owner director node, then again, all volumes in the volume service must undergo mandatory offline file system recovery. There is such a thing as voluntary, which we're not going to deal with. If the system finds any problem with the directory, and but this is mandatory because we're not sure what the metadata state is in this volume. Each volume in the volume service is unavailable for the duration of FSRC and while waiting for FSRC to run. The duration is dependent on the number of objects in the volume and may be substantial, may be quick, may be substantial. We want to avoid FSRC. Again, I'm going to repeat this again and again. Volume service should not be manually moved if the service is offline, degraded, or does not have a current failover director without first consulting us. There are times when you just have to do it. If somehow the backup was disabled because of the various complications here, and the primary is flat failed, it's not coming back, we have to move it. But we want to evaluate the situation before we do that. You move the volume service when the director's transaction logs are not available. This may result in losing the transaction log. Moving the volume service is appropriate if the primary is permanently failed. But again, let's try not to avoid that. A volume, and this is important, a volume service should not be manually moved if the volume assigned to the service is seeing significant metadata slowness. Troubleshoot the slowness. You're going to move it, and then it's going to be slow on the new director as well. 99.9% of the time, if there's metadata slowness, the cause is the client metadata pattern. We need to find out what the pattern is and fix that. And to do that, we need logs and traces, and we can go through that process. President does not automatically reassign a volume service that has failed over to the backup director if the primary director is not responding or if its PAN manager service is unhealthy. We've got something that failed over or lost its backup. It stayed there for more than a few minutes and still got no backup. President's not going to assign a backup. In many cases, it's better to wait for the primary volume owner, again, become available to lessen the possibility of losing the transaction logs. So it's going to take no further action. If a volume service is in no backup for some length of time, you call us, we assess the situation. However, if the primary volume owner is logically removed from the realm, the president is going to assign a new volume owner director. This is also because there's balance issues concerned. It's just things are just too complicated for the president to be randomly assigning things. Should I manually assign a backup director? It's tempting to assign a backup director if the current volume service does not have a failover director, but this is not always a good idea. If the current volume owner director is the backup director, the system will not even allow you to assign a different backup director. It will allow you to move the volume service to a different primary director, but that's often not a safe move, so we need to evaluate this. The president may be currently working to enable a backup director. Manually assigning a backup director caused the president to start all over again on this. President does not fail a backup service back to the primary director or re-enable a service in backup mode if reconstruction or FSRC is running. Doing this would cause reconstruction or FSRC to start over. With FSRC, that's a huge big deal. With reconstruction, it may or may not be a big deal. We'll talk about that later. President will take the proper course of action once the current reconstruction or FSRC is completed. So basically, President does not enable a backup director for a volume service after about 10 minutes. If reconstruction or FSRC is not running and does not enable, what you want to do is contact us so we can evaluate the situation. Replacing a volume owner director. And this is the same thought as we went through when we were talking about RepSet members. Before replacing a director node, manually move all primary volume service assignments the director has to other directors. Why? Because the president is going to move the volume services immediately instead of waiting 90 seconds. Much more graceful solution than having the volume services fail over if the director simply disappears. We said earlier, I gave an illustration about moving the backup, but it's really not necessary and it can be complicated. The president reassigns a backup director once the director being replaced is logically removed from the realm. Okay. Also, just a reminder, if the director being replaced is a member of the RepSet, remove it from the RepSet as well. Okay. Transaction log persistence for Bravo in director nodes. Remember, this is a review from the directors. They store their transaction log records in VDIM. If PAN Manager restarts, the transaction logs do not need to be saved because the NVDIM is not controlled by PAN Manager. Transaction logs can sit right here in the SD realm. However, if the node reboots or loses power, the NVDIM controller copies the transaction logs from the NVDIM to the NVDIM persistent flash storage. The SuperCAP provides the power to the controller to do this once it's done. This action does not depend on any software service. The NVDIM is armed and knows how to do this. But remember, on the Bravo ASD100s, it does not provide this save if the director is power cycled by IPMI or the front power button. The Delta ASD200, not a problem. When the nodes boot, the NVDIM controller copies these transaction logs back from the flash storage on the NVDIM into SD-RAM, deletes the copy on the SD-RAM, and on Bravo ASD100s, this happens while the node is on the network, but it does not come online until this is complete. On the ASD200s, like the ASU nodes, all of this happens in BIOS. You don't see it. We're not going to talk about what happens on the alpha directors. Basically, on the alpha, all these are stored in volatile memory. The shelf battery is supposed to provide the director with the time to copy these transaction logs to disk. Each transaction log has a size fixed in the code because the Bravo and Delta director loads can store larger transaction logs. We define the transaction log state appropriate to them, and the alpha director logs have a smaller transaction log size. Skip over that. All right. Now, I don't believe that I told you what the transaction log. Well, I did mention it. For the FM, the critical ones are the list of the clients that have callbacks for objects in the volume. The actual callbacks are not there. It's just the list of the clients that we're keeping track of. There's some other things. The storage manager, the most two very important transaction logs are its repair log. Before it does any kind of repairs, it says, I'm going to repair this object. It repairs it, then it deletes it. And for the storage manager, it's also keeping track of the open write caps. Clients have write capabilities on these objects. Both the file manager and the storage manager also have performance caches. These are not critical. These are kept in volatile memory. If they're lost, it's no big deal. The director nodes just have to repopulate them. For the file manager, a directory cache for recently read directories and attributes for recently accessed objects. And these performance caches are much larger than they are on the alpha nodes, giving the ASD directors a significant performance advantage. Callback partition. The file manager must keep a record of which director flow clients have outstanding callbacks on which PennFS objects. Remember, if client A has an exclusive callback, client B wants to read it, we have to break callbacks. We store these records in the callback cache. These are in volatile memory. These are huge. It also stores information about non-cacheable directories in this cache. Individual callbacks are not stored in the volume service transaction logs. That data is too large. If Pan Manager restarts and we lose the callback cache, when the FM restarts, it's going to contact, it knows which clients have callbacks. So it's going to contact the clients and says, your callbacks are now garbage. Flush them, get new callbacks, and I will give you new callbacks. Now the clients would know that anyway, because they keep track of the FM ID number and says, we're talking to a different FM than we were before. But nevertheless, it is the FM's job to make sure that it tells all the clients they have to get new callbacks. Total number of primary and backup volume services that any director can host is 5. This is because the limitation of space on the Bravo NVDIMM. This is very rarely an issue. This is only an issue on a realm that used to have director blades. It's transitioning to ASDs, and maybe you had a whole bunch of volume services, and the corrective action is to create new volumes on the volume services, migrate the data from the old and the new, delete the old volume, and you can delete some of the volume services. Review. Can the volume service listing be sorted by the failover director node, by the backup director node?
Yes.
Yes, they can. Can the volume service listing be searched for a volume name?
No.
Cannot be sorted that way, but I believe it can be searched. Let's see. Yep, it can be. Cannot be sorted, but it can be searched. See? It can't be sorted because it really doesn't make any sense. On all these search forms, any value that the page knows about can be searched. Yeah, it's a long way to click. There we go. Can the storage administrator move a volume service from one primary director to another?
Yes.
Yes, they can. Can the storage administrator move the backup director from a volume service from one director to another?
Yes.
Yes, you can. Is it always safe to move a volume service from one director to another?
No.
Not always. If you're rebalancing for metadata load and everything is green, it's usually safe. If everything is not green and anything that is not the green has anything to do with the volume service, want to stop and talk to us. Can a volume be moved from one volume service to another?
No.
No, that's correct. Can a volume service be chosen for a volume to be created in?
Yes.
Yes, it can. Does the president fail a volume service over right away if the primary volume owner director is not responding?
No.
That's correct.
It waits 90 seconds.
Indeed. When the primary volume owner is not responding, but the volume service has not yet failed over to the backup director, what state are the volumes in that volume service in?
Some sort of non-accessible state.
That's right, not accessible. It all depends. In the logs, it says down. In the GUI, it says not accessible. Don't panic. If you see this and you see also a volume service, president's going to fix it. When the volume owner is not responding and the volume service has failed over to the backup director, what state are the volumes in that service in?
They're back to an accessible state.
That's right. Back online. Back online. Assuming that they were online before. If they're in reconstruction, they would go back to that state. Does the president always assign a backup director to a volume service right away if the volume service does not have a failover director?
No.
That's correct. Could be reasons. There's a volume in reconstruction or FSRC, none. Or if the president's kind of working on it, maybe not. Or if it's on the backup director or any number of things. Reasons. Should the storage administrator usually manually assign a backup director to a volume service that does not have one?
No.
Right. Usually not. Sometimes yes, but usually not. What memory device does a Bravo or Delta director node use to store transaction logs?
The NVDIM?
NVDIM, yes. Does a Bravo or Delta director node lose its transaction logs if it ungracefully loses power?
No.
No, does not. The only reason it would do this is if the NVDIM had failed. And usually we already know that before failure. Questions on this? All right, we're going to take a break a little bit early. It falls right on a nice point. So let's come back at